June 15, 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. Behind the barbed wire, German prisoners expected chains, punishment, and scraps of bread. Instead, the air filled with the smell of hickory smoke and sizzling meat. They stared in disbelief as American soldiers carved barbecue briskets bigger than anything they had ever seen, while children ran past with ice cream cones and bottles of Coca-Cola. For men raised on Nazi propaganda, this was more shocking than defeat itself. How could a nation treat its enemies with such abundance? Stay with us as we uncover the full story. And if you want more powerful, untold history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and support this channel. June 1945. The headline blazed across certain newspapers in Europe. German women POWs in America. It sounded sensational, almost scandalous. A mixture of curiosity and suspicion. But the reality, recorded in ledgers and camp reports, told another story. The United States had not brought over masses of German women prisoners. It was nearly all men, veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps and the Wehrmacht divisions captured in Tunisia and beyond. Yet the myth held power, and in that paradox lies the entry point. The world expected barbed wire, cruelty, and deprivation. Instead, what unfolded on American soil was abundance, decency, and meals that tasted like nothing the prisoners had ever imagined. The correction matters because it reveals something deeper. A misleading headline promised spectacle. The reality offered something more subversive. The United States had absorbed over 425,000 German POWs between 1943 and 1946. They were housed in camps scattered from Maine to Texas, watched carefully, yet treated within the bounds of the Geneva Convention. More than that, they were fed, clothed, and often welcomed into the orbit of everyday American life. The contrast between expectation and reality became the true story, and for many Germans, it was far more shocking than any rumor of women behind the wire. Consider the irony. The Reich had built its myth on images of decadent, weak democracies. Soldiers were warned of American corruption, poverty masked by propaganda, food shortages worse than in Germany. One diary from the Afrika Korps, confiscated on the Tunisian front, warned, "The Americans starve their own people, yet they drown the world in lies of abundance." And yet, within weeks of surrender, those same soldiers would be biting into cuts of beef so large they looked more like artillery than rations. This story is not merely about diets and camp menus. It is about a battle for perception, one that unfolded not with rifles but with brisket and Coca-Cola. It is about how daily exposure to plenty could do what leaflets and speeches never could, dismantle the certainty of Nazi propaganda. "I was shocked," one prisoner later recalled, "to see Americans throw away what we in Germany would count as treasure, even crusts of bread, potato peels, or bacon grease." That shock was the first crack in an ideological wall. To understand how a barbecue in Texas could become a weapon in the arsenal of democracy, we must follow the prisoners back to the beginning, to the deserts of North Africa, the surrender that stunned the world, and the long, crowded convoys across the Atlantic. What they saw on those journeys, and what they would see after, would upend everything they thought they knew. May 1943. The dust of Tunisia settled as columns of weary German and Italian soldiers trudged into captivity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps had fought hard, but supply lines had strangled, fuel had vanished, and the Allies pressed with overwhelming force. In just weeks, nearly 275,000 Axis troops laid down their arms. It was one of the largest surrenders of the war. Many expected execution, or at best, brutal prison marches under the desert sun. Instead, they were loaded into trucks, given water, and told they were bound for a destination beyond imagination, the United States. The first step was Algiers, then Oran, ports swollen with Liberty ships. These steel workhorses of American industry had been designed to haul cargo, tanks, grain, fuel, across U-boat-infested seas. Now, in a paradox that even the sailors found surreal, they ferried human cargo. Tens of thousands of prisoners each month. Between June 1943 and the war's end, upwards of 30,000 German prisoners a month crossed the Atlantic. Bunks crammed into cargo holds, barbed wire rigged across decks, and guards with carbines paced the narrow aisles. The smell was unforgettable, salt spray seeping through steel hatches, mingling with sweat, damp wool, and the sour tang of seasickness. In cramped spaces, prisoners murmured to each other in disbelief. "They are sending us to America," one diarist scrawled. "The land of milk and honey," or so the Führer says, with sarcasm. But doubt gnawed. Even in the holds, trays of food arrived with portions unimaginable in Europe. Bread, soft and white, meat, even butter. One soldier later recalled, "On the ship, we ate better than at the front. I did not know what to make of it." Above, Liberty ships steamed in convoys, escorted by destroyers and trailed by wary eyes scanning for periscopes. U-boat packs still prowled. The prisoners listened to the hum of engines, the thud of depth charges rolling into the sea, and the eerie silence that followed when no explosion came. Every thump reminded them their lives now depended on the enemy's navy. The irony was not lost. German soldiers, fed by American cooks, protected by American sailors, carried to captivity by the very arsenal their leaders had dismissed as weak. The voyage itself became a lesson in scale. The prisoners counted ships, dozens, sometimes more than 100 moving in coordinated lines. They saw cranes unloading cargo in Algiers, then reloading supplies bound for Europe. Numbers whispered through the decks. The Americans were building one Liberty ship every 3 days. To men from a bombed-out Reich, it felt like standing inside an endless factory, a machine that could not be stopped. Yet in those dim, swaying holds, another paradox grew. The guards were not cruel. They shared cigarettes. They spoke casually of baseball games back home, of wives and sweethearts, of farms in Kansas or sawmills in Oregon. For many prisoners, it was the first hint that their enemies were not the monsters of propaganda reels, but ordinary men in ordinary uniforms. One remembered the sound most of all, the clang of mess trays as food was served. That sound, he later said, was America to me. It meant I would eat. It meant I would live. But the true revelation still lay ahead. Norfolk waited, with its docks, warehouses, and the first glimpses of a land untouched by bombing. From the sea to the soil, the prisoners were about to learn what abundance looked like up close. June 1943. The Liberty ship slid into the harbour at Norfolk, Virginia. For many German prisoners, it was their first sight of America. Cranes towering like steel giants, warehouses stacked with goods, train lines humming with locomotives, and no ruins, no rubble, no broken glass. To men who had left behind bombed-out cities, it was as if they had arrived in another world. The disembarkation was brisk but orderly. Prisoners shuffled down gangplanks under guard, their boots clanging on the steel. What struck them immediately was not hostility, but efficiency. Lines of trucks waited. Red Cross officers stood nearby, and American soldiers carried clipboards instead of rifles. It felt more like a factory than a prison, one soldier later recalled. Everything moved with precision, and everything seemed to be in endless supply. Processing began with medical inspection. Doctors in clean uniforms, with stethoscopes slung around their necks, checked blood pressure, teeth, lungs. Many of the prisoners, hardened by desert fighting, assumed it was a pretext for humiliation. Instead, they were told their weight, their deficiencies, their conditions. Records show the average German POW arriving in Norfolk weighed 25 to 30 pounds under his expected range. Nearly 1 in 5 displayed signs of malnutrition, night blindness from vitamin A deficiency, gums bleeding with scurvy, rashes from pellagra, weakness from beriberi. The paradox hit hard. Men who had fought believing themselves the elite warriors of Europe were suddenly revealed, in medical terms, as underfed and fragile. And then came the blow that none expected. Rations. Hot food, not crusts. Milk poured freely. Bread soft and white, not black and gritty. Meat appeared in portions so generous the men at first suspected it was a trick. One recalled, "We waited for the cameras to be told this was a show, but no one came. The food was real." In the processing camps, the menu was standard army fare. Scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, beef stew and coffee. Gallons of coffee. To prisoners used to ersatz grain beverages or chicory, the aroma of roasted beans was intoxicating. Diaries captured their disbelief. "Even their soldiers do not eat like this, surely," wrote a corporal from Bremen. But they did. The psychological weight of these meals cannot be overstated. German propaganda had painted America as a hollow giant, a country unable to clothe or feed its citizens. Yet here, the enemy not only fed its soldiers well, but fed its prisoners nearly as well. One doctor's report noted, within weeks of arrival, average prisoner weight increases by 10 to 12 pounds. Morale appears confused. Prisoners laugh as they eat, then fall silent, as if afraid it will be taken away. The processing centers also brought first glimpses of American abundance in everyday items. Prisoners saw warehouses stacked high with crates of fruit, tobacco, even chocolate. They watched trains roll past, each car filled with grain, coal or machinery. The sheer scale unsettled them. "We did not understand how they could have so much," recalled one sergeant, while still fighting a war across the world. Smells lingered in their memory, diesel from the locomotives, pine tar from the docks, and above all, the aroma of food, constant and inescapable. To step off a ship half-starved and breathe in roasting meat and baked bread was to feel, in one sensory rush, the collapse of a worldview. But Norfolk was only the beginning. Ahead lay long trains pulling inland, through landscapes untouched by war, fields green with corn, orchards heavy with fruit, towns where shop windows gleamed with goods. If Norfolk cracked the facade of Nazi propaganda, the journey to America's heartland would smash it to pieces. From the Norfolk docks, the prisoners were herded onto long lines of Pullman cars, their windows barred but still open to the air. The clatter of steel wheels began the next chapter of their captivity, a journey across the American interior. For many, this ride was more astonishing than the food itself. The train surged westward, passing through the Shenandoah Valley. Out the windows lay rolling orchards heavy with apples, fields carpeted with alfalfa, barns painted red and white like something from a storybook. The men pressed against the glass, whispering to each other. Not a bomb crater, not a ruin, one remembered. For soldiers who had left behind smoking German cities, the sight of towns with intact roofs and children playing in streets was a paradox almost too great to bear. The sounds defined the memory, the whistle of the locomotive echoing across hills, the rattle of the tracks beneath their feet, and in between, the laughter of American families waving as the train passed. Sometimes children ran alongside, tossing chewing gum or chocolate through the bars. A corporal from Cologne later wrote, "I had not seen a chocolate bar in years. A child gave me two, and I felt ashamed that the enemy's children had so much to spare." As the train rolled deeper south, the scale of America became clear. Endless miles of farmland, cornfields stretching to the horizon, cattle grazing behind sturdy fences, irrigation ditches glistening under the sun. To men used to ration cards and shortages, the abundance was staggering. The United States was not only feeding its vast army overseas, it was feeding millions at home and still had enough to waste. One prisoner muttered, "If they can do this, how can we ever win?" By late summer 1943, many trains converged on Texas. There, in the baking heat, construction crews had raced to raise entire cities of wood and wire. One of the largest was Camp Swift, near Bastrop, completed in barely 4 months. The camp sprawled over thousands of acres, with rows of barracks, guard towers, kitchens, workshops, and even a hospital. By autumn, it held about 5,000 German prisoners. Camp Swift embodied the American paradox, a prison that looked to the prisoners more comfortable than the barracks they had left behind in Germany. Electric lights glowed at night. Hot water poured from taps. Latrines flushed with the pull of a handle. Each barrack had stoves for winter, fans for summer, and mess halls that served 3 hot meals a day. It was as if we had entered a modern world we were told did not exist, said Unteroffizier Hans Müller. The sensory impressions of Texas seared into memory. The air smelled of mesquite and dust, cicadas droned in the heat, and evenings glowed with the smoke of cook fires drifting over the prairie. At first, the prisoners were wary, expecting harsh discipline. Instead, guards spoke casually, sometimes even joking. They issued uniforms, bedding, soap, and told the men their work would come soon. The paradox tightened its grip. Here were prisoners, yet treated with more dignity and material comfort than they had known as free men under the Reich. They were captives, but they slept on mattresses stuffed with cotton and ate portions that left them full. One diary recorded, "We are behind wire, but in our stomachs, America feels like freedom." And then came the moment that crystallized this confusion. The invitation to an American ritual unlike any in Germany, the summer barbecue. It was here, around pits of hickory smoke and sizzling brisket, that perception shattered entirely. July 4, 1944, Camp Swift, Texas. The sun blazed white in a cloudless sky, cicadas rattled in the trees, and the smell of smoke curled above the wire. For German prisoners, the date was meaningless. Another day in captivity. For Texans, it was Independence Day, and celebrations meant food, music, and gathering. By late afternoon, the paradox unfolded. Prisoners, marched out under guard, were about to witness a feast that defied every lesson drilled into them by the Reich. Rows of pits lined the open ground, each dug shallow into the earth. Inside, hickory and mesquite coals glowed red, the smoke rising sweet and sharp. On grates above, slabs of beef brisket, some 12 to 15 pounds each, hissed and dripped fat that sizzled when it struck the embers. The air carried layers of scent, pepper, paprika, garlic, and the dark sweetness of brown sugar. For men accustomed to watery stews and coarse rye bread, The aroma itself was overwhelming. A rancher named Buck Morrison, broad-shouldered and sunburned, lifted the lid of a steel smoker and speared a cut of meat, the bark crisp, the smoke ring glowing pink just beneath the surface. He laughed as he showed it to the prisoners. 12 hours, he said, his voice carrying, slow and steady. That's how you do it. The Germans stared, some shaking their heads. No one cooks meat for prisoners, one whispered. Yet here it was. Alongside the brisket came trays of sides. Cornbread crumbling golden, beans simmered with molasses, potatoes baked until their skins split, jars of pickles and bowls of coleslaw crisp with vinegar. Children darted between tables, carrying bottles of Coca-Cola that hissed when opened, 5 cents at any store but free today. The prisoners watched as American families piled their plates, laughing, singing, even offering food across the invisible barrier. A teenage girl slipped a slice of peach cobbler to a stunned sergeant. He wrote later, I thought of my sister, queuing for bread in Hanover. Here they give dessert to the enemy. The music struck next. Fiddles, guitars, a harmonica's wail. Country tunes rolled out over the prairie, mixing with the pop of firecrackers and the hum of voices. Some prisoners clapped along, uncertain, embarrassed. Others turned away, unwilling to show emotion. But all felt the same weight. The contradiction of being fed like guests while confined as captives. Numbers reinforced the shock. In Germany, ration books limited civilians to 2 pounds of meat per week, often less. Here, in a single meal, men were offered more than their families at home might see in a month. Briskets of 15 pounds each roasted by the dozen. Hundreds of pounds of beef consumed in a single evening. This is not propaganda, murmured Dr. Wilhelm Huffman, a camp physician. This is daily life, and it destroys everything we were told. The taste lingered. Smoky, rich, tender. Brisket sliced thin, juices soaking into bread. A corporal from Stuttgart later recalled in his diary, I could not sleep that night. I had eaten so much I was sick. But more than full, I was confused. Why do they feed us so? We killed their sons, and still they give us meat. That night, as fireworks cracked above Bastrop and the prisoners lay in their bunks, the memory of barbecue smoke clung to their clothes. For many, it was the first undeniable proof that America was not the land of poverty their leaders had described. The enemy had revealed its true weapon. Not brutality, but generosity. And yet, this was only one encounter. The deeper shock would come not at holiday feasts, but in the steady rhythm of daily life, in canteens, in payslips, in small luxuries that prisoners never expected to hold in their hands. For all the spectacle of a 4th of July barbecue, it was the daily rhythm of camp life that astonished the prisoners most. What they saw day after day, written into menus, stamped into payslips, handed over in small tokens, made clear that the abundance of America was not a holiday exception, but the ordinary pulse of the country. Breakfast began the pattern. Prisoners awoke to the clang of mess hall bells and found trays set with eggs, scrambled, fried, sometimes boiled, alongside oatmeal sweetened with sugar, toast spread with butter, and thick slices of bacon. Coffee flowed freely, dark and hot, not the bitter substitute of roasted acorns that had become normal in Germany. To have coffee every morning, wrote one prisoner from Munich, was more than our generals had at home. Lunch and supper reinforced the shock. Beef stews thick with vegetables, fried chicken crisp with seasoned batter, loaves of fresh white bread baked on site, pies filled with apples, cherries, or pumpkin depending on the season. Peanut butter, sticky, sweet, strange, became a subject of fascination. One diary noted, at first it disgusted me. Then, I could not stop eating it. Even potato chips, a snack invented only decades earlier, appeared in canteens. And then came pay. Under the Geneva Convention, German prisoners were entitled to compensation for their labor. In American camps, this meant tokens or scrip redeemable at the camp canteen. With these, men could buy cigarettes, candy bars, soap, shaving cream, writing paper, and, to their amazement, Coca-Cola in glass bottles chilled with ice. A sergeant from Bavaria wrote, I sat in the shade, drinking a Coca-Cola, listening to a radio. I thought, this cannot be captivity. The numbers shocked them as much as the luxuries. The US Army allotted POWs nearly the same rations as its own soldiers, about 3,500 calories per day, compared to German civilian rations that had dipped to 1,500 or less by late 1944. Where German families queued for hours to buy a few ounces of butter, prisoners in America spread it thick on white bread without thought. The disparity gnawed at them. Guilt, disbelief, envy, and gratitude all mixing in uneasy measure. Even entertainment entered the picture. Camps offered libraries stocked with American novels, German classics, and even Goethe in translation. Film nights screened Hollywood pictures, westerns, comedies, sometimes war films carefully selected to avoid offense. Music drifted across the wire, swing records on gramophones, church choirs, even visiting bands. Prisoners could form orchestras, perform plays, or paint murals on barracks walls. For many, the luxury that cut deepest was simply freedom of movement. Yes, there was barbed wire. Yes, guards with rifles patrolled. But inside the wire, men could walk fields, tend gardens, even play soccer matches before cheering crowds. In some towns they were hired out as labor to farms or sawmills, riding trucks past astonished locals who saw enemy soldiers waving like ordinary workers. A guard remembered one Texan farmer telling him, "Hell, those Krauts work harder than the boys I pay." The contrast to what they imagined was stark. Germany's propaganda had promised a decadent America collapsing under rationing, a place of soup lines and shortages. But the canteens, the payslips, the Coca-Colas, and the steady supply of butter and meat told another truth. The daily shock was not in fireworks and feasts, but in the casual, almost thoughtless abundance. One prisoner summed it up in a letter, censored but preserved. "If this is their normal life, then we have been lied to more deeply than we ever knew." And yet, the most startling encounters were still to come. Not within the camps, but outside them, when prisoners owners walked American streets, escorted but unshackled, and saw with their own eyes the prosperity of ordinary towns. By the middle of 1944, something extraordinary began to happen. German prisoners who had once braced themselves for punishment and starvation now found themselves boarding trucks, not to toil under guard in hidden quarries, but to ride into American towns. Their destination: farms, factories, sawmills, and sometimes even civic projects. The paradox was plain. Men who had marched into war as conquerors were now laborers in the very heartland of the country they had been taught to despise. The sight astonished them. Instead of ruined cities or rationed breadlines, America revealed neat rows of houses with painted porches, overflowing markets, and children peddling bicycles with baskets full of fruit. A prisoner from Hamburg recalled walking past a grocery window in Kansas. "There was more meat hanging there than in all of Hamburg in a month. I thought it was a dream." Numbers bore out the scale. By 1945, more than 200,000 POWs were employed as laborers, contributing an estimated 45 million man-day ships ferried them back across the Atlantic. Only this time, there was no mystery about what awaited on the other side. Germany was not the land of plenty described in propaganda. It was a wasteland, bombed cities, hollowed factories, and ration cards that promised more than they delivered. The contrast between departure and arrival was heartbreaking. In America, a prisoner might have eaten 3 eggs for breakfast, washed down with coffee and a glass of milk. In Hamburg or Cologne, his family was lucky to share 1 egg among 4 mouths. In camp, he bought Coca-Cola or chocolate with his canteen scrip. At home, his children waited in line for turnips or watery bread. It was like falling from heaven into hell, one recalled upon stepping onto German soil. Statistics bore out their despair. By 1946, average daily rations in occupied Germany had fallen below 1,000 calories, sometimes as low as 800 in the British zone. Malnutrition spread, especially among the young and elderly. Black markets thrived. For men returning from a land where prisoners were fed steaks and pies, the shock was almost unbearable. A diary from a former POW in Nebraska recorded, "My wife looked older. My children were thin. I could not explain to them that in prison I ate better than they did in freedom." And yet, amid the guilt and hunger, something else lingered, a memory of what they had seen. They had lived in a democracy that treated enemies with decency, that allowed prisoners to earn pay, to read books, to play soccer, even to taste barbecue on national holidays. They had seen supermarkets overflowing, farms running without shortages, and civilians living without fear of bombers overhead. The paradox crystallized. They had come as conquerors, believing themselves masters of a decadent, crumbling nation. They left humbled, convinced that America's greatest weapon was not its tanks or planes, but its abundance, its ease, its ordinary prosperity. One veteran summed it up in an interview decades later. "We were defeated twice. First by their armies, then of work to the U.S. economy. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Nebraska, felled pine in Arkansas, and built roads across the Midwest. Payment came not in dollars, but in canteen coupons. Yet even these were riches compared to what awaited their families back home. The paradox of perception deepened. These were enemy soldiers, yet they were greeted with civility, sometimes even kindness. Farmers invited them to sit under shade trees for lemonade. Church groups brought sandwiches. In rare cases, they were even offered home-cooked meals. One Minnesota woman later recalled, "They looked so young, so tired. My mother couldn't help but give them bread and jam. They thanked her as if it was gold." But shock carried another layer. The prisoners expected hostility, perhaps stones, curses, or angry glares. Instead, they saw Americans who were not starving, not beat, down, but thriving in a way they had been told was impossible. They were driven past fields of corn, stretching farther than the eye could see, grain elevators rising like towers, and freight trains so long they seemed to have no end. The irony was cruel for them. While they marveled at plenty, letters from home painted pictures of want. Rations in Germany had dropped below 1,200 calories a day for civilians by late 1945. Cities lay in rubble, winter fuel was scarce, children fainted in schools from hunger. Yet here in America, prisoners rode through towns where bakeries tossed unsold loaves at closing time, where children bought ice cream cones with spare pennies, where barbecues flared in backyards on weekends. The effect was disorienting. "We saw no poverty, no hunger, no despair," one Bavarian prisoner later admitted. "What we saw was a land that lived as if the war did not exist. It was then I realized. Everything we had been told was a lie." Still, suspicion lingered. Some whispered that it was all a show, that perhaps the Americans staged abundance for their eyes. But each trip outside the camp confirmed the same reality. Full markets, busy factories, towns untouched by bombing, families living without fear. Even the smell of the air, of gasoline, grilled meat and baked bread, told of a life impossible to fake. The shock of those excursions was greater than any feast or barbecue. Behind barbed wire, one might suspect illusion. On American streets, one could not deny the truth. The abundance was not propaganda. It was the ordinary rhythm of life. And yet, as the war ground to its end and Germany itself lay in ruins, the prisoners knew their stay in America could not last. Soon, they would be shipped back, to a homeland shattered, to cities starving, and to families who could scarcely imagine what their sons had seen. By late 1945, the great reversal began. Trains rumbled once more, not with men arriving fresh from battlefronts, but with prisoners bound for ports. From there, convoys of liberty shone by their way of life. Some carried this lesson into the rebuilding of Germany. Former prisoners returned with a new respect for democracy, for fairness, for the possibilities of peace. Historians have noted how the POW experience became a quiet but real influence in post-war reconciliation. They saw a future, one scholar wrote, because in America, even as captives, they had lived inside it. The story of German POWs in America is not one of cruelty or deprivation, but of paradox. Enemy soldiers expected chains and found Coca-Cola. They expected rations of crusts and found barbecue feasts. They expected propaganda and found daily truth written in calories, pay slips, and overflowing markets. In the end, the barbed wire rusted away, the camps emptied, the men returned. But the memory endured, and with it, a lesson echoed across time. America's might lay not only in bombs or factories, but in its ability to show an enemy a different kind of power. The power of plenty, the power of freedom, the power of ordinary life lived without fear. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its abundance.